Welcome to Babblecom 5. This is episode 11 of season 4 of Babylon 5, Lines of Communication. Sheridan is winding himself up watching ISN, laying the groundwork for a rescue mission to retake the station. Ivanova wonders why he does it. He calls it gathering intelligence. He doesn't think they're ready to move yet, it's just war drums. Ivanova pipes through a sketchy message from Franklin, one way only. He uses code words to mask the message, but the gist is the Mars resistance leaders are ready to meet with him. While he discusses this with Number 1, who notes that Earth is tightening the noose on them, Marcus runs in to tell them that the Red Planet Hotel has been bombed, with the target being an Earth security unit, but there were civilian casualties. This was the sort of escalation their contact was fearing, and she heads back into the main part of their base. The Norzai, a race near Minbari borders, have been attacked, and Delenn is puzzled as to why their ships haven't intervened, as they have historically been given protection by the Minbari. The Minbari Delenn is speaking to explains that with the dissolution of the Grey Council, the warrior caste is not supporting the religious caste treaty. He is seeking more information on the unknown attackers, and we see what looks like a Drazi Sunhawk being surrounded by a group of fighter ships we've not seen before. Quite an interesting moment between John and Delenn when she tells him she's going out with a wing of White Stars to look into the raiders. He wonders why she doesn't send Linnea, but that isn't her style and isn't reflective of who she is, and she reminds him of that. He notes that similar raids have happened near Pakmarar space, all unprovoked. Many races are under strength after the war, so John just sees this as the Carrion Eaters coming along. The Juno, an Earth Omega-class cruiser, approaches Mars. Number 1 very nearly literally tears Philippe, one of her cell members, a new one, for the bombing which he cleared with someone on Earth based, but not with her. He claims there wasn't time, but she says in the time it would have taken him to call her, she could do several unspeakable things to him, which she will do next time she isn't consulted. He now seems to have a clear idea of the chain of command. Turns out he's also a former lover of hers. Still watching ISN, Sheridan switches it off, but has a light bulb moment, which involves waking Ivanova up, which she does not appreciate, especially when John then spectacularly fails to compliment her on her choice of nightwear. Damned if you do, etc. He's in giddy kipper mode because he figures if ISN can mess with the truth, then they can dish it out as it should be. So he takes her to the war room, once she's had a chance to change into something more appropriate. He says this was her idea, in the sense that during the war, she used the Babcom system to tell people what was going on, which planets were safe, and so on. Now Sheridan wants her to do that on a bigger scale to combat Earth's propaganda. He says she has a face people trust. She'd rather have a face they fear. But Susan will become the voice of the resistance, as the French did in World War II, and Sheridan skips off whilst Ivanova contemplates shooting him. As Delenn's wing of 7 White Stars heads for Norzai space, she speaks with the Minbari who brought her the intelligence. She is troubled by what he said about the warrior caste, realising she hasn't been focusing on Minbar much since the war. He says that the Grey Council was what bound them together, and now the warrior caste are even looking to make a council of their own. Where once all the castes lived together and shared resources, the warrior caste are said to have cast some religious castes out of their cities, so Delenn has much to think on. Back on Mars, the other cell leaders have arrived and the meeting is decidedly boisterous. There are inevitably accusations of abandonment, but as Marcus points out, they have been a little busy with little intergalactic war. More seriously, they try and make clear that by bombing civilians they weaken support at home rather than strengthening it. Further, they have to stay focused on Clark and not the overthrow of EarthGov as a whole. Marcus knows this is hard. He was raised on a Risha colony that also suffered Earth Alliance taxation, but right now the man is the issue, not the position he holds. Franklin says that Sheridan will look to give Mars independence when the battle is won, and asks for their patience, saying that Sheridan is the sort of man you can believe in when he makes such a promise, but he also wants the bombings to stop for now because it isn't doing them any favours. The White Stars come out of hyperspace and form up in an attack formation, as the Markab military transport we saw earlier is under heavy attack from the unknown fighters. The captain calls them a dark enemy before the transmission cuts out. Linnea cautions about misunderstandings on first contact, and Len reminds him she was there when Ducat died, and she does not make the same mistake twice. So they open comms, but they don't know the language, and yet when Linnea sends Interlac codes, the aliens, the Drach, respond in Minbari rather than Interlac. Delenn realises that must mean they've had prior contact with Minbari and turns to find Pharrell holding a gun on her. She reminds us as much as him that Minbari don't kill Minbari, but he says he can hurt her. He just needs her to listen to what they have to say. Lennier is too far away to do anything and orders the other White Stars to fall in as they follow the Drak fighters. Franklin and Marcus have succeeded in winning the support of the other cells for the time being, but Number 1 does call Franklin out on his lie in assisting her, because there is no way Sheridan could have known and sent a message about the bombings, as ISN hasn't made them public knowledge. He knew she needed the support on that point, so he played a card, and she appreciates that the lie was in her favour. She trusts them. Marcus thinks that's not the only thing she appreciates, and says that at times like this people reach out to one another, and Franklin should not be so defensive about the possibility of something developing with Number 1. Marcus's radar seems spot on when Number 1 reappears shortly afterwards to note that with their hotel bomb they're on their own. Franklin gets a dinner invite, Marcus gets guard duty. Marcus tells him to seize Passion when he can, and he owes him 50 credits. The White Star fleet pulls up short of a much larger Drak vessel, which sends out a life pod to dock with Delenn's ship. Pharrell assures them the visitor will be unarmed. The creature that moves through the ship seems out of phase and disrupts energy systems as it passes, announcing itself as an emissary of the Drak rather than being a Drak itself, using a translator after taking an interest in the White Star's control systems. Pharrell explains that his family died not at the hands of the warrior caste, but because they cast them out in a polar region to walk to the next city. It might not have been murdered directly, but it was as good as, and other Minbari can't quite believe it, so are afraid to act. And he says the warrior caste have made their own council, as he said they had. He says they need the Drak to support them against the warrior caste, not to fight, but to show strength. He says he has offered the Drak several deserted worlds on their borders, and their presence there would help the religious caste. He says the Drak need them because they have just lost their home. Lennier whispers something to Delenn, and she clearly agrees, asking the Drak what their home was called, to which the answer is simply home. She tells the emissary that they will consider their proposal and return here in 7 days with their answer. Pharrell thanks Delenn, mentioning her name. At that, the Drak pauses, repeating her name, before moving off the bridge. The music picks up a notch as Delenn asks Pharrell urgently if the Drak knew who was meeting them. He says no, there wasn't time. Delenn now confirms what Lennier's suspicion was. The home the Drak just lost was, in fact, Zahadum. She felt it as soon as she saw it, and the emissary's reaction to her presence confirms it. She knows that as soon as the emissary's shuttle is clear, they will be attacked, thanks to Pharrell. The other White Stars are ordered to stand by. Running and jumping out are considered as options, but Lennier fears they would be cut down attempting to either, because owing to the time it would take them to get up to speed, or the energy spike the jump engines will broadcast. The reason they haven't fired yet is that the White Stars have drifted closer to their mothership, so they start warming up their beam weapons but don't lock on. Delenn asks if Lennier knows how to skin dance. He says he's seen it done, but would need 5 years training to be able to do it himself. They don't have that long, but the White Star's AI can probably handle it. So they slave their wing to their controls and start to move away slowly, pouring on the speed as Lennier detects their weapons lock. The White Stars pull away from the hull and over the hull of the mothership, with the Drak holding fire, until finally Delenn tells them to break off and jump away, at which point they start taking hits, with one White Star destroyed before it can jump. Delenn's ship is hit too, with wreckage fatally wounding Pharrell, who apologises when they are in hyperspace before he passes. Delenn says it is she who should apologise for being away from home too long. Lennier says damage is substantial, but auto repair systems are active. He says he is setting a course for Babylon 5, but Delenn is showing her warrior side. She says that Drak have taken out a White Star, destroyed League ships. They will not be allowed to leave. So the half-dozen remaining White Stars jump back into the area and come in firing, fully prepared for the fight. Still heavily outnumbered, the White Stars have the advantage of surprise and the superior ship when committed, plus the enemy mothership is a huge target, seemingly reliant on its fighters for its defence. It also seems to need to use the local jump gate to escape, so Delenn orders Lennier to beat it there and to end this. which a concentrated beam from the White Star duly does, that it's clear the ship is not as hard to damage as the Shadow vessel. Now they can head back to Babylon 5, but as Lanier notes and Delenn agrees, they have a problem back home. As Delenn enters what was the war room, she notes that Minbari cities remain the same for centuries, Riley observing that she leaves for 3 days, and Sheridan redecorates. He notes that other raiders are the same as the ones she encountered, the servants looking to be the masters. The end of the war looks like it might just be the beginning of the first one's legacy. Delenn says it's also touched John, although he's trying to hide it from the others. He's not the same since he came back from Zahadum. He has 20 years left, but they haven't spoken about it. The war and destruction is the easy part. The hard part is pulling it all back together again. Delenn needs to do that on Minbar with the Cass, and John needs to do it with himself and Earth. And she says that her being away will be helpful because he needs to be dangerous to resolve the Earth situation, and he's holding back while she's here. He can't really argue with that. She needs to leave for Minbar in the morning, and as they go to dinner, she asks after Franklin and Marcus. They haven't been heard from, but Sheridan's sure Stephen has his hands full. And so he does. Fna fna. I must admit, I think I find this one of the weaker episodes of this season, which is an odd statement to make because I can't quite figure out what it is that makes me feel like that. Let me try and pin it down. The Voice of the Resistance plot piece is almost trying too hard to have Sheridan be super excited and Ivanova super irritated at having her sleep interrupted. It doesn't quite feel natural, but inevitably that's a very subjective thing. Same with Sheridan continuing to watch ISN when he knows what line they're taking. Like Ivanova, I'd question why he keeps on letting them get to him. It would be funny were it not psychologically serious. Not to say his reaction to it doesn't make sense, it clearly does and is constructive, more constructive than going another round with Garibaldi. Now, Farrell I don't think we've met before, yet we're simultaneously introduced to him and he gets killed off in one fell swoop. Did I take to him and he's teaming up with the Drac? Not so much. No real investment in the character for me, I'm afraid. Let's face it, pulling a gun on another Minbari and in fact aiming it at her face is not a way to engender "I'm just trying to scare you, not kill you" ways of thinking. Taking her into an unknown situation and letting a member of an unknown race on board the ship strikes me as foolhardy at best. And the emissary, I think they gave him a wibbly-wobbly effect because they were worried about the Grey 17 issue with an unconvincing prosthetic. So they tried to mask it. Maybe I'm just in a horribly negative mindset tonight, I don't know, but I think if anything, we actually saw too much of it as it meandered through a corridor as Minbari tried to politely dodge it. Felt like padding, perhaps? Interesting that it seemed to be sucking power out of everything it drifted past, however, perhaps some form of distortion field to prevent it being scanned too closely, or a rickety attempt to replicate the Shadow's phasing ability. So, tactically and effects-wise, the Drac engagement felt off to me. Very dark in places, and I mean, not a lot of light. Not unreasonable in space, but we do want to see the action. I quite like the Drac fighters, but they were quite detail light, and Farrell seems to be very confident of their abilities as if he'd been given their tech specs to compare with the average White Star. I'm not sure the skin dancing concept really worked, nor am I convinced that a ship that big would have 0-point defense capability. For that matter, why would a ship that big not be capable of opening its own jump point? Then we've got Lanier being particularly evil looking when he's told to end this. And then this new obsession with having a humongous fiery explosion blossoming on a ship when it goes up. It's all just a bit chaotic compared with, say, Shadow Dancing, which was probably smart in showing smaller chunks of combat with fewer ships. One thing I will give credit for here is the nice flip Lanier does in front of the jump gate in order to fire at the ship he just overtook. Because of course, like many science fiction ships, all their big guns are at the front, so they can't defend their rear. Whether a single White Star should be able to do that much damage to a capital ship, I don't know. The whole thing was very much out of the Sheridan playbook, which is interesting because we've seldom seen Delenn in command of this much combat directly and solo. I will also give credit for them keeping track of their numbers, because when the White Stars come back in, there are only 6 when they lost one getting out, having had 7. It's a little point of detail, but I noted that. Although I still think that given they knew the Drac beam weapons could hurt them, even going back in with all guns blazing seemed a massive risk, and there seemed to be a huge number of inactive Drak fighters under the mothership for some reason. As I say, the whole thing just felt a bit random to me, and if the Drak were so worried about their mothership being damaged, then they should never have initiated combat, let alone telegraph the fact they were about to do it, even if Delenn hadn't realised that was what they were going to do. Right, got that off my chest, thanks. So, Marcus and Franklin still on Mars, and now caught up in infighting within the cell thanks to an ill-judged attack on Earth forces. Surprising lack of discipline for a covert team in a confined space, although we've established the domes are probably pretty tough. Killing Martians, or potentially innocent Earthers, however, is clearly the proverbial own goal, and number one is entitled to have a go at the guy, no two ways about it. Interesting that Franklin is smart enough to read the room and help with that. This isn't really the sort of situation we're used to seeing him in at all, but he handles it remarkably well. Marcus is also very good because he can empathise with him owing to what he's been through as a colonist. And of course Franklin, the Kirk of Babylon 5, beds number one in the closing moments, albeit with Marcus having egged him on in a very earnest way to do so, which was nice, even if he clearly wasn't planning on having to be within earshot. Maybe I need to watch it again, but Glenn's final conversation with John I found a little hard to grasp. I think what she's saying is that Zahadum changed him, but he doesn't want to acknowledge that to the others for fear of what they might think, which is why what Garibaldi has been saying about him has provoked such a strong reaction in him. He also hasn't spoken to her about his shortened lifespan. It's like he's distancing himself all the time, and has now turned to Earth to continue doing that. So it now seems that we could have an Earth arc, a Minbar arc, and a Mars arc going on at the same time, which again is perhaps symptomatic of the danger that the show was facing in having just 11 episodes left to potentially do everything it was wanting to do in 33 episodes. I don't envy them that. Yet still, a lot of this episode, even down to the white stars slowly turning in space and so on, felt like it was filling time rather than trying to hurry things along. I'm in a negative mode again, aren't I? I guess when it comes down to it, Babylon 5 sets its bar so high by its own making that when it inevitably has a perfectly fine episode, you end up calling it out simply because you've seen better. Seems perverse, I know. How JMS was able to keep the pace going for 5 years with the sheer volume of writing he took on personally whilst battling the networks, I've no idea. He's doing watch along with JMS type videos at the moment, by the way, on his Synthetic Worlds channel. Maybe YouTube will link across for you, but if you're still here, you get the tip. Well done. His solution to the copyright issue is just to make you hit play on your copy, then he talks. Smart. So what do you think of this one? 5 stars? 1 star? Bits of both? See you for the next.